Welcome to Ash and Iron, where we dig through the ashes of history to find the iron truth beneath. Today, the Knights Templar, everything you need to know about history's most legendary warrior monks. Picture, if you will, a world balanced on the edge of a knife. The year is 1119 and the dust has barely settled from one of history's most audacious military campaigns. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, sits precariously in Christian hands after the bloodbath of the First Crusade, but the roads leading to it run red with pilgrims' blood. Bandits lurk behind every rock formation. Saracen raiders strike without warning. The journey from the Mediterranean coast to the sacred sites where Christ walked is a gauntlet of terror that claims hundreds of lives each year. European Christians mortgage their farms, sell their possessions, endure months of miserable sea travel, only to be cut down within sight of their goal. Their bodies rot in the merciless sun of the Levant, their bones picked clean by vultures, their dreams of redemption scattered like sand in the desert wind. This is the world into which a new brotherhood would be born. Not another company of mercenaries fighting for gold, not another monastic order singing hymns behind monastery walls. Something unprecedented. Something that would reshape the medieval world and echo through the centuries into our own time. Warrior monks. Men who took vows of poverty, yet accumulated wealth beyond measure. Soldiers who swore chastity, yet were accused of unspeakable depravity. Knights who pledged obedience to God, yet kings would come to fear them. Defenders of the faith who would be destroyed by that very faith. Welcome to the story of the Knights Templar. A tale of courage and corruption, faith and finance, triumph and tragedy. A story that begins in blood-soaked Jerusalem and ends in the flames of Paris. A story that asks uncomfortable questions about power, about righteousness, about what happens when the instruments of God's will become too mighty for mortal men to control. This isn't just medieval history. This is the origin story of modern banking, of international finance, of the dangerous intersection between military might and economic power. This is the story of men who changed the world and paid the ultimate price for it. The year is 1118, or perhaps 1119. The exact date has been lost to history, swallowed by the chaos of those early crusading years. What we know is this: a French knight named Hugh de Payen stood before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal that must have seemed half mad to the assembled nobles. Hugh was no youth seeking glory. He was a seasoned warrior in his 40s, a man who had seen the Crusades' brutality firsthand, who understood that winning Jerusalem was one thing, but hold it quite another, and he had a vision. Hugh proposed to gather a small band of knights who would dedicate their entire lives to protecting the Christian pilgrims making the perilous journey to the Holy Land. Not for pay, not for plunder, but for God alone. These knights would take monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, just like any monk secluded in a European monastery. But instead of copying manuscripts or tending gardens, they would patrol the dangerous roads with swords in hand and prayers on their lips. They would be soldiers of Christ in the most literal sense possible. 8 other knights joined Hugh in this audacious pledge. Their names have come down to us: Godfrey de Saint-Omer, André de Montbard, Payen de Montdidier, Archambault de Saint-Agnan, Geoffrey Bison, Hugh Rigaud, and 2 men recorded only as Russell and Gondomar. 9 men total. 9 knights who would reshape Christendom. Think about that number, 9. Not a company, not even a proper military unit. Just 9 middle-aged knights who looked at the world's most dangerous pilgrimage route and said, "We can fix this." King Baldwin, whatever his private thoughts about this peculiar proposal, recognized both its nobility and its potential usefulness. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was desperately undermanned. Every able-bodied fighter was precious, and here were 9 experienced warriors offering their services for free. Baldwin did more than give his blessing. He gave them lodging in a wing of his royal palace, which sat upon the Temple Mount itself, that sacred plateau where Solomon's temple had once stood nearly 2,000 years earlier. It was from this location that the knights would take their name the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights of the Temple, the Templars. Imagine those early days. 9 knights in a vast palace, surrounded by the ghosts of ancient history. Below them, the Muslim dome of the rock gleamed golden in the harsh Mediterranean sun. Around them, the barely pacified city bustled with tension between victor and vanquished, Latin Christian and Greek Orthodox, European and Arab. And before them, the mission to make safe the roads that had been death traps for decades. They adopted a simple uniform initially, whatever armor they could afford or scavenge, marked with a simple cross. They slept in communal quarters. They rose before dawn to pray, then rode out into the unforgiving landscape to patrol the roads, to escort pilgrim caravans, to fight off bandits and raiders. It was grueling, thankless work. For every bandit they killed, 2 more appeared. For every pilgrim they saved, another died on a different road. But they persisted. Day after brutal day, they persisted. Word of these peculiar warrior monks began to spread. Some thought of them as saints. Others thought them fools. Many simply wondered how long 9 men could possibly survive in such a dangerous enterprise. Yet they did survive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the roads began to grow safer. Not safe, mind you, not even close, but safer. Pilgrims began to tell stories of mysterious knights appearing out of nowhere to drive off attackers, then disappearing again without asking for reward or even thanks. The 9 knights were becoming legends. But 9 men, no matter how dedicated, could only do so much. Hugh de Payen understood this. If his vision was to truly succeed, the order needed to grow. It needed official recognition. It needed the backing of the church itself. It needed resources, recruits, and legitimacy. And so, in 1127, Hugh did something that would prove even more important than the order's founding. He went back to Europe. Hugh's journey through Europe was a recruitment drive, a fundraising campaign, and a political mission all rolled into one. He visited royal courts and bishops' palaces. He told the story of the Holy Land, of the dangers facing pilgrims, of the small band of knights trying to make a difference. And people listened. More than that, they believed. Nobles began pledging their sons to the cause. Wealthy merchants donated funds. Most crucially, Hugh secured an audience at one of the most important ecclesiastical gatherings of the age, the Council of Troy, in 1129. The Council of Troy would change everything. Assembled there were some of the most powerful figures in Western Christendom, including one man whose influence would prove decisive, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was already a legend in his own time, a Cistercian monk whose piety and eloquence had made him perhaps the most respected religious figure in Europe outside the papacy itself. When Bernard spoke, people listened. When Bernard wrote, people copied his words and spread them across the continent. And Bernard believed utterly in Hugh de Payen and his warrior monks. Under Bernard's guidance, the council gave the Templars official papal recognition. Pope Honorius II himself endorsed the order, transforming it from a small band of freelance protector into an official arm of the Catholic Church. But even more important than this recognition was what Bernard wrote afterward, a treatise titled In Praise of the New Knighthood. This document was nothing less than a justification for the entire concept of warrior monks, and it became the order's founding mythology. Bernard drew a stark contrast between secular knights, whom he painted as vain, greedy, and concerned only with earthly glory, and the new Templars, who fought for the glory of God alone. He wrote that death in battle against the enemies of Christ was not to be mourned, but celebrated, for it was the surest path to heaven. He argued that these warriors were performing God's work, that their violence was holy violence, that they were the living embodiment of Christian virtue combined with Christian strength. It was powerful stuff, and it worked. Recruitment exploded. Donations poured in. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon were on their way to becoming one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. But with official recognition came official rules. Bernard, drawing on his experience as a Cistercian, crafted what would become known as the Latin Rule. a detailed code of conduct that would govern every aspect of Templar life. This wasn't just a list of do's and don'ts. It was a complete blueprint for a new way of life, one that married the discipline of the monastery with the martial culture of the knighthood. And it was strict. Brutally strict. If you want to understand the Templars, truly understand them, you must understand the rule they lived by. Because the Latin rule wasn't just a document, it was the lens through which every Templar viewed his entire existence. It dictated when he woke, what he ate, how he dressed, whom he could speak to, how he fought, and how he died. It was comprehensive, unforgiving, and absolute. And it started with the three great monastic vows. Poverty. Every man who joined the Templars had to surrender everything he owned to the order. Note most of it. Everything, his lands, his gold, his horses, his sword, his clothes. Even small personal mementos from his family required special permission to keep. The Templar owned nothing, nothing at all. He slept in communal quarters on a simple straw mattress with standard issue blankets. He wore the uniform the order provided. He ate the food the order served. He rode the horse the order assigned. And if anyone tried to give him a gift, he had to turn it over to his superiors immediately. There are accounts of Templars being severely punished for accepting so much as a loaf of bread from a grateful pilgrim without first getting permission. This wasn't some symbolic gesture. The penalty for being found with hidden wealth was excommunication. And if the violation was discovered after death, disinterment. That's right. If a Templar died and was buried in consecrated ground, and then it was discovered that he'd secretly kept some coins or jewels, they would dig up his corpse and throw it to the dogs. The message was clear. Poverty wasn't negotiable.
Chastity.
Templars were forbidden from any sexual contact whatsoever, not just with women, but with anyone. They were not permitted to kiss even their own mothers or sisters. They were instructed to avoid the company of women entirely when possible. If a conversation with a woman was absolutely necessary for some reason, it was to be conducted in full view of other brothers and kept as brief as possible. The rules specifically warned against the company of women, calling it dangerous and likely to lead to sin. This wasn't just about sex. This was about cutting the Templars off from one of the most basic human connections, ensuring that their loyalty remained undivided and their focus remained pure. Obedience. This was perhaps the most important vow of all. A Templar's will was not his own. He obeyed his superiors instantly and without question. If his commander ordered him to ride into certain death, he rode. If his commander told him to hand over his sword, he handed it over. The rule made explicit that nothing pleased Christ more than obedience, and nothing was more worthy of damnation than disobedience. This wasn't the blind obedience of a mindless automaton. The Templars were trained to think, to assess battlefield situations, to make tactical decisions. But when a superior gave an order, that order was law, as absolute as gravity. These three vows formed the foundation, but the Latin rule went into exhaustive detail about every other aspect of Templar life. Let's start with the daily schedule, because it was punishing in a way modern people can barely imagine. A Templar's day began around 2 in the morning with the ringing of a bell for matins, the first of the canonical hours. He would rise in darkness, still wearing his undergarments because he'd slept in them, and make his way to the chapel for prayers that could last an hour or more. Then back to bed for a few hours of broken sleep. Dawn brought Lords, the morning prayer service. After this came Prime around 6 in the morning, followed by Terce at 9, Sext at noon, None at 3 in the afternoon, Vespers at sunset, and finally Compline before bed. 8 prayer services per day. 8 times the Templars stopped whatever they were doing, formed up, and spent time in formal prayer and psalm singing. On top of this, every Templar was expected to recite additional private prayers throughout the day. The amount of time devoted to prayer was staggering. Between these prayer services, life was regimented with military precision. Meals were communal and conducted in near total silence while a chaplain read passages from scripture. The food itself was plain, adequate: bread, vegetables, fish on most days, and meat 3 times per week except during fasting periods. They drank wine diluted with water. The rule was specific about table manners too. Templars were to eat what was served without complaining, to share from common dishes, and to clean their utensils afterward. No private meals. No snacking between meal times. No complaints about the food. Their clothing was equally regulated. The famous white mantle with the red cross, which has become the Templars' most recognizable symbol, was actually reserved for knight brothers. Lower-ranking members wore black or brown mantles. The red cross itself wasn't added until 1146, when Pope Eugenius III granted it as a symbol of martyrdom and the willingness to shed blood for Christ. Templars were forbidden from decorative clothing of any kind. No fancy buckles, no colorful trim, no personal flair. They were allowed basic wool undergarments, a tunic, breeches, a belt, and a mantle. That was it. Their appearance was meant to be uniform, humble, and purely functional. Even their hair was regulated. Unlike secular knights who might sport elaborate hairstyles, Templars were instructed to keep their hair short and their beards long, though neatly trimmed. This served a practical purpose in helmet-wearing combat, but it was also a symbol of their separation from worldly vanity. They were not to bathe without permission. They were not to let blood for medical purposes without permission. They were not to go into town without permission. They were not to ride a horse without permission. Permission, permission, permission. Everything required permission. The punishments for breaking the rule were severe and public. Minor infractions might result in being forced to eat meals sitting on the floor like a dog for a period of days or weeks. More serious violations could mean flogging in front of the assembled brothers. Major crimes like fleeing from battle, striking a fellow Christian in anger, or sexual misconduct could result in being stripped of the white mantle, which was effectively being expelled from the order. This was considered a fate worse than death for many Templars. There's one particularly chilling account of an Irish Templar master who misappropriated funds and was literally starved to death in a cell in London as punishment. But the rule also showed surprising compassion in certain areas. Sick and elderly brothers were to be cared for with special attention. The order maintained infirmaries and allowed sick brothers more comfortable accommodations and better food during their recovery. Horses, which were crucial to the Templars' effectiveness as cavalry, were to be treated well and never abused. A knight who killed or lost his horse through carelessness or rage could be stripped of his rank. Even the rules section on warfare showed a kind of grim pragmatism rather than bloodlust. Templars were not to fight unless necessary or ordered. They were not to pursue fleeing enemies to the point of endangering themselves or their brothers. They were not to break formation without permission. This was the world of the Templars, a world of constant prayer, iron discipline, communal living, and absolute obedience. It was a hard life, an impossibly hard life by modern standards. So why did men flock to it? Why did nobles give that wealth and comfort to sleep on straw and eat in silence? What drove thousands of men across 2 centuries to take up the white mantle and red cross? Part of it was genuine religious devotion. This was an age of intense faith, when people truly believed in heaven and hell, in salvation and damnation, in the literal war between God and Satan playing out across the earth. Bernard of Clairvaux's writings had convinced many that there was no surer path to paradise than defending the Holy Land. Dying in battle against Islam's armies was a direct ticket to heaven, no questions asked. For men who had lived violent lives as secular knights, who had committed murders and atrocities in petty feudal conflicts, the Templars offered a chance at redemption. Put on the white mantle, defend the pilgrims, and wash away a lifetime of sin in holy blood. But it wasn't just about the afterlife. The Templars offered something else too: belonging. In an age where your entire identity and future were determined by the circumstances of your birth, the order was a strange kind of meritocracy. Yes, you had to be of noble birth to become a knight brother, but within the order what mattered was your dedication, your skill, your willingness to follow the rule. A Templar was part of something larger than himself, something that transcended the petty squabbles of feudal lords and the endless cycle of medieval violence. He was part of a brotherhood that spanned continents, that answered to no king, that existed to serve God alone. That kind of meaning, that kind of purpose was intoxicating. And make no mistake, the Templars were elite. They were the best trained, best equipped, most disciplined fighting force in Christendom. To wear the white mantle with the red cross was to be recognized instantly as a warrior of the highest caliber. Kings and generals begged for Templar contingents to bolster their armies. Enemies feared them on the battlefield. There was glory in it, even if that glory was supposedly forsaken in the name of God. A man might take a vow of poverty, but he still knew that when he rode into battle under the Templar banner, he was riding with legend. The Order was not a monolithic block of identical warrior monks. It was a complex organization with a strict hierarchy and various roles, each essential to the Templars' effectiveness. At the top sat the Grand Master, elected by a council of senior knights and serving for life unless removed for incompetence or heresy. The Grand Master commanded the entire Order, made strategic decisions, negotiated with kings and popes, and bore ultimate responsibility for the Templars' success or failure. It was a position of immense power, but also a crushing burden. Below the Grand Master came the Provincial Masters, who oversaw Templar operations in major regions like France, England, or Spain. Then came the commanders of individual Templar houses, called preceptories. These men managed the day-to-day operations of Templar estates, coordinated local military actions, and handled the financial affairs that would eventually make the Order so wealthy. The military structure included the Marshal, who commanded Templar forces in battle, the commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and various specialized officers like the Draper, who managed clothing and equipment, and the Treasurer, who handled finance. But Knight Brothers, the armored cavalry who fought in battle, made up only a fraction of the Order. The majority of Templars were actually sergeant brothers, men of non-noble birth, who performed crucial supporting roles. Some sergeants were light cavalry who fought alongside the knights but with less expensive equipment. Others were foot soldiers, administrators, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers who kept the Templar machine running. Then there were the chaplain brothers, priests who ministered to the spiritual needs of the Order. And beyond these professed members were countless servants, squires, and workers who were affiliated with but not full members of the Order. This brings us to the question of how one became a Templar. The initiation ceremony was shrouded in secrecy, conducted behind closed doors with only members present. This secrecy would later prove catastrophic when enemies of the Order used it to spread the darkest rumors about what actually happened during these ceremonies. But based on accounts that have survived, the reality was far more mundane than the lurid accusations would suggest. A candidate for the Order would be brought before the assembled brothers of his local preceptory. He would be asked a series of questions. Was he married or betrothed? Did he owe debts he could not pay? Was he a member of another religious order? Did he suffer from any hidden disease? Was he a free man or serf? Was he physically capable of bearing arms? These questions were practical, designed to ensure the candidate could actually fulfill his obligations without creating problems for the Order. If the answers were satisfactory, the candidate was taken to a private chapel. There, he would be asked 3 times if he truly wished to join the Order, if he understood the hardships involved, if he was prepared to forsake his old life completely. If he answered yes each time, he would kneel and place his hands between the hands of the presiding officer, then swear his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The officer would place the white mantle on the new brother's shoulders, kiss him on the mouth as a sign of peace and brotherhood, and the transformation was complete. A new Templar had been born. It was this kiss, this innocent ritual of medieval brotherhood, that would be twisted into accusations of heresy and perversion. But in the moment, it was simply a formal gesture, no different from the kiss of peace exchanged during Mass. The new Templar was then instructed in the rule, assigned his duties, and absorbed into the life of the Order. His old identity was shed like a snake's skin. He was a Templar now, and would be until death. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because the Knights Templar didn't just invent a new kind of soldier. They accidentally invented modern banking. Let me explain how a group of monk warriors who had taken vows of poverty ended up controlling more wealth than most European kingdoms. It started simply enough. Nobles joining the order had to turn over all their possessions, remember? And that meant the order accumulated lands, castles, farms, vineyards, and other properties at an astounding rate. Every time a wealthy knight took the white mantle, the Templars got richer. But it wasn't just new recruits. Nobles who went on crusade would often place their estates under Templar management for the duration of their absence. Sometimes they never came back and the Templars kept the property. Sometimes they owed the Templars for services rendered and paid in land. However it happened, the result was the same. The Order's land holdings exploded across Europe. By the mid-1200s, the Templars owned estates in virtually every kingdom in Western Christendom. They had farms in England, vineyards in France, monasteries in Spain, castles in the Holy Land. They owned entire villages and collected rents from thousands of peasants. They ran sheep ranches, timber operations, and fisheries. They controlled ports and collected customs fees. They owned mills and forges. The sheer scale of their holdings was staggering, and all of this property generated income, massive amounts of income, which flowed into Templar treasuries. But land wealth, while substantial, wasn't liquid. You couldn't quickly convert a castle or a farm into gold when you needed to fund a military campaign or pay for supplies. The Templars needed a way to move wealth efficiently across vast distances, to convert assets into usable funds, to protect their money from theft and embezzlement. And in solving these problems for themselves, they created banking. The key innovation was the letter of credit. Here's how it worked. Let's say you're a merchant or pilgrim in Paris who needs to travel to Jerusalem. You've got a bag of gold coins, but carrying that much wealth on a months-long journey is basically suicide. Bandits will kill you for a tenth of what you're carrying. So instead, you go to the Templar preceptory in Paris. You deposit your gold with them. They count it, record it in their ledgers, and give you a document encrypted with a special code that only Templars can read. You then travel to Jerusalem carrying just this document. When you arrive, you go to the Templar headquarters on the Temple Mount, present the document, and withdraw your gold, minus a small service fee. This was revolutionary. For the first time in European history, you could safely move wealth across continents without physically carrying it. The Templars had effectively created a form of banking check, and the implications were enormous. Merchants could conduct long-distance trade safely. Crusaders could fund their campaigns without risking robbery. Pilgrims could make their holy journeys without being murdered for their money. The Templar network made all of this possible because they had preceptories everywhere, taught using the same accounting system, taught trustworthy because the brothers had taken vows of honesty and were harshly punished for any financial malfeasance. But the Templars went further. They began lending money, something the church officially frowned upon as usury, but which was absolutely necessary for a functioning economy. The Templars got around the usury prohibition through creative accounting. Instead of charging interest, they would claim they were charging rent on property, or fees for services, or compensation for risk. Whatever you called it, the effect was the same. You borrowed money from the Templars, and you paid back more than you borrowed. Kings became regular customers. Louis VII of France borrowed massive sums to fund his crusade. Henry II of England essentially used the London Temple as his royal treasury. When Richard the Lionheart was captured and held for ransom, a substantial portion of that ransom was paid through Templar financial networks. The order became, in effect, the bank of choice for European monarchy. Never. They were trusted absolutely because everyone knew the brothers themselves couldn't steal the money, bound as they were by their vows and the rule's harsh punishments. The Templars also pioneered other financial innovations. They performed currency exchange, converting English pounds to French livres, to Italian florins and back again. They handled estate management for nobles who were on crusade. They collected taxes on behalf of kings. They brokered land deals. They even issued bonds that could be traded. By the late 1300s, the Paris Temple was functioning as something very close to a modern central bank, holding the French treasury, processing royal payments, and handling vast sums of other people's money. This financial acumen made the Templars incredibly powerful, but it also made them vulnerable. They were now owed debts over the heads of the most powerful men in Europe. They knew the financial secrets of kings and popes. They had leverage over monarchs who owed them money, and perhaps most dangerously, they had become fabulously wealthy as an organization while maintaining the fiction that each individual brother remained in poverty. Think about the contradiction here. A Templar knight couldn't own even a loaf of bread without permission, yet the order controlled more liquid capital than most kingdoms. Individual brothers slept on straw and ate in silence, yet the order owned palaces. The knights had taken vows of poverty, yet they were universally recognized as the richest organization in Christendom after the papacy itself. This tension between individual poverty and corporate wealth would prove difficult to navigate, especially as the Order's original military mission became less relevant. The Templars tried to square this circle by arguing that their wealth served God's purpose. The gold in their vaults wasn't theirs, it belonged to God, and was merely being held in trust to fund the defense of the Holy Land. The banking operations weren't about profit, they were about facilitating crusading efforts and protecting pilgrims. The vast estates weren't displays of worldly power, they were resources to support the warriors of Christ. There was logic to these arguments, but it was logic that wore thin as Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands and the crusading spirit began to fade. By the late 1300s, the Templars were in an impossible position. They were a military order without an active military mission. They were a financial empire pretending to be a monastic brotherhood. They were immensely powerful, but ultimately dependent on the goodwill of secular authorities, who increasingly viewed them with suspicion and envy. The stage was being set for catastrophe. But before we get there, we need to see the Templars at the height of their military glory and witness the battles that made them legendary. The dawn breaks over Galilee on November 25th, 1177, revealing an unlikely sight. A Christian army of just 500 men, maybe 100 of them full knights, arrayed against a Muslim force that outnumbers them 30 to 1. The young leper king Baldwin IV has brought his tiny force against Saladin himself, the greatest Muslim commander of the age, who commands somewhere between 20 to 30,000 battle-hardened warriors. By all rights, what's about to happen should be a massacre. The Christians should be annihilated. Baldwin should die along with his kingdom. But among those 500 Christians are 80 Templar knights. The Battle of Montcazard has become one of the most celebrated in Templar history. And for good reason. It perfectly encapsulates what made these warrior monks so formidable. Saladin's massive army had been raiding through the kingdom of Jerusalem, best unopposed, growing increasingly confident and careless. They had spread out to plunder more efficiently, their guard down, their discipline loosened by easy victories. Baldwin IV, despite being just 16 years old and ravaged by leprosy, saw an opportunity. The Christian charge hit Saladin's forces like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The Templar contingent, led by their master Odo Saint Amand, punched through the Muslim vanguard and drove straight for Saladin's position. The Muslim army, caught completely off guard, began to fragment and panic. What should have been an easy mopping-up operation turned into chaos as heavily armored Christian knights carved through their ranks. Saladin himself barely escaped with his life, abandoning his camp and most of his army in a desperate flight back to Egypt. The Christians didn't just win that day at Montcazard, they annihilated a force 30 times their size, killing thousands and sending the rest fleeing in terror.
And the Templars were credited with being the spearhead that made victory possible. Their discipline, their fearlessness, their devastating charge turned an impossible situation into one of the most stunning victories in Crusader history.
But Montcazard was an exception. More often, the Templars' refusal to retreat or surrender led to catastrophic losses. Which brings us to one of the darkest days in the Order's history. May 1st, 1187, at a place called the Springs of Cressel. Gerard de Rietfort, the Templar Grand Master, was not a man known for sound judgment. Hot-headed, impulsive, and obsessed with glory, he had become master of the Order through political maneuvering rather than martial skill or tactical wisdom. On that May Day, he led a force of about 90 Templar knights and 40 Hospitaller knights against a Muslim raiding party of 7,000 horsemen. Let me repeat that. 130 knights against 7,000. Several of Gerard's own officers urged caution, including the master of the Hospitallers. They argued that engaging such an overwhelmingly superior force was suicide. Gerard reportedly responded with an insult, questioning their courage. Then he ordered the charge. What happened next was predictable and horrific. The Templar and Hospitaller Knights thundered forward, their lances lowered, their battle cries ringing across the Palestinian hills. They hit the Muslim vanguard and broke through it. For a moment, it might have seemed like Montgisard all over again. But this time, the Muslims didn't panic. They had numbers, and they used them. The Christian Knights pushed deeper into the Muslim formation, and then the trap closed. From our sides, thousands of Muslim horsemen swarmed over the tiny Christian force. The slaughter was absolute. Of the 90 Templars, only Gerard de Ridefort and 2 others survived. The Hospitaller Master Roger de Moulin was killed. Hundreds of Christian soldiers died. It was a catastrophe caused entirely by Gerard's reckless decision to fight against impossible odds. But the consequences extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The Battle of Cresson shattered Christian morale and depleted the military orders just when they needed strength most. Because Saladin wasn't done. That even close. 2 months later came the battle that would break the Crusader kingdoms, Hattin. The political situation in the Kingdom of Jerusalem in mid-1187 was a poisonous stew of factional fighting and bad decision. King Guy of Lusignan was weak, indecisive, and universally despised by the more capable nobles in his kingdom. The best of these was Raymond of Tripoli, a seasoned commander who understood Muslim tactics and respected Saladin's capabilities. When Saladin besieged the city of Tiberias, where Raymond's wife was trapped in the citadel, Raymond made a brutal, sound recommendation. Do not march out to relieve the city. Let it fall if necessary. Saladin's army couldn't sustain a long siege. They would eventually have to retreat, at which point the Christians could retake Tiberias without risking their field army. It was good advice. Guy initially took it. The Christian army, some 20,000 strong, including 600 Templar and Hospitaller Knights, made camp at Sephoria, a well-watered position with good defensive terrain. They could wait there safely while Saladin's army slowly bled away from desertion and supply problems. Then Gerard de Redfort had a private conversation with King Guy. We don't know exactly what was said in that late-night meeting, but we know the result. The next morning, Guy gave the order to march. The entire Christian army would leave the safety of Sephoria, cross 15 miles of waterless, brutal terrain in the height of summer, and attempt to force battle with Saladin's army. Raymond of Tripoli reportedly said that the decision sealed their doom. The march was a nightmare. Saladin's mounted archers harassed the Christian column constantly, shooting arrows into their ranks and then wheeling away before the knights could retaliate. The Templars, forming the rear guard, bore the brunt of these attacks. Knights wearing 40 pounds of armor trudged through scorching heat with no water, their horses exhausted, their men dropping from heatstroke. By evening of the first day, they had only made it about halfway to Tiberias and were forced to camp in the open, still with no water. That night, as the Christians suffered from desperate thirst, Saladin's forces set the dry grass around their camp on fire. Smoke choked them. The psychological torture of watching flames creep closer while being too exhausted and thirsty to move properly must have been unbearable. And in the morning, when the sun rose again, the Christians found themselves surrounded on a plateau near 2 rocky hills called the Horns of Hatti. The battle was less a battle than a slow-motion massacre. The Christian knights, exhausted and dehydrated, attempted several charges to break through the Muslim lines. Each time, the disciplined Muslim forces simply opened ranks, let the knights exhaust themselves, then closed in again. The Christian infantry, nearly mad with thirst, broke ranks and fled toward the Sea of Galilee, seeking water. Most were cut down. By afternoon, it was over. The True Cross, the most holy relic in Christendom, which had been carried into battle, was captured. King Guy and most of his nobles were taken prisoner. Of the 600 knights of the military orders, only about 200 survived to be captured. And then came the killing. Saladin was generally known for his mercy and chivalry, traits unusual in the brutal warfare of the era. He treated captured nobles well, even releasing many for ransom. But for the Templars and Hospitallers, he showed no mercy at all. He offered a bounty of 50 dinars for each military order knight brought to him alive. Then he had them all executed. Templar after Templar was brought forward and beheaded. Some of the executioners were professional soldiers, skilled with the sword, and the deaths were quick. Others were Islamic scholars and ascetics who had begged for the privilege of killing a Templar, and their executions were clumsy, brutal affairs requiring multiple cuts. The field ran red with the blood of the warrior monks. Out of those 200 captured Templars, only one survived. Gerard de Rydefort himself spared so he could be ransomed day. The Battle of Hattin destroyed the military capability of the Crusader states. Within months, Jerusalem itself fell back into Muslim hands. The Templars lost their headquarters, their original purpose, their position at the center of the Christian holy war. The order continued, of course. They relocated to Acre, then to Cyprus after Acre fell. They kept fighting, kept dying, kept doing what they had always done. But something fundamental had shifted. The high tide of the Crusades had passed. The Templars would never again be the dominant force they had been in the 12th century. And as their military relevance diminished, the tensions surrounding their wealth and power would grow until they became unbearable. The conspiracy was breathtaking in its scope and its secrecy. Philip IV had been planning it for months, possibly years, coordinating with his closest advisors, Guillaume de Nogaret, his chancellor, and Enguerrand de Marigny, his minister. They had compiled a list of charges against the Templars, accusations so shocking and so detailed that they seemed to come from insider knowledge. They had located several former Templars willing to testify against the order. They had drafted arrest warrants and confiscation orders. They had prepared dungeons and torture chambers. All of this was done in absolute silence. Not a whisper reached the Templars. The orders went out from Paris on September 14th, 1307. Sealed letters carried by royal messengers to bailiffs and seneschals throughout France. The seals were not to be broken until the night of October 12th. When those seals were finally broken, and the orders read, royal officials across France must have been stunned. They were to arrest, simultaneously at dawn, every single Templar in the kingdom. Not just the leaders, everyone. Knights, sergeants, chaplains, even servants associated with the order. No exceptions. No warnings. Total surprise. The execution was flawless. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, royal troops descended on Templar preceptories across France. In Paris, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, was arrested while still in his nightclothes. He had attended the funeral of King Philip's sister-in-law the day before, serving as a pallbearer, suspecting nothing. Throughout France, Templars were rounded up, shackled, and thrown into dungeons. The speed and coordination were remarkable. Within a single day, one of the most powerful organizations in Christendom had been effectively neutralized. The charges laid to the arrested Templars must have seemed insane. They were accused of denying Christ during their initiation ceremonies, of spitting or urinating on the cross, of worshipping an idol called Baphomet, described variously as a head, a cat, or a demon, of engaging in homosexual practices during initiation and afterward, of wearing cords around their waists that had been touched to this mysterious idol, of conducting their ceremonies in secret because these rituals were too blasphemous to be witnessed, of heresy, corruption, and moral depravity on a scale that defied belief. These weren't random accusations. They were carefully crafted to push every button of medieval paranoia and disgust. Denial of Christ was the ultimate heresy. The idol worship suggested devil worship or paganism. The sexual accusations played on existing prejudices and stereotypes. The secrecy of their ceremonies, which had once been a security measure, now looked like evidence of guilt. Why conduct ceremonies behind locked doors unless those ceremonies were shameful? But accusations mean nothing without evidence, and Philip knew he needed confessions. So he turned to the Inquisition and its tools of persuasion. Medieval torture was not the random sadism of Hollywood movies. It was systematic, documented, and conducted according to specific rules and procedures. The goal wasn't to maim or kill the prisoner. It was to produce pain so intense that confession became preferable to continued suffering. and the Inquisition had perfected these techniques over decades of hunting heretics. Templars were subjected to the strappado, their hands tied behind their backs, then hoisted by a pulley until they hung suspended, their shoulders dislocating with audible pops. They were subjected to the rack, strapped to a wooden frame while their limbs were slowly stretched until joints separated and ligaments tore. They were subjected to fire torture, their feet coated in fat or oil, then held over flames until the flesh began to cook and peel away. The chronicler William of Plaisians described watching men's bones fall out of their feet after this treatment. They were starved, kept in darkness, denied sleep. They were shown the instruments of torture and told in explicit detail what would be done to them. They were promised pardon if they confessed, death if they refused. And they were asked leading questions, questions that assumed guilt and demanded only confirmation. Did you deny Christ when you were initiated? Did you spit on the cross? Did you worship the idol? The questions went on for hours, days, weeks. One by one, they broke. In Paris, of 138 Templars interrogated, almost all confessed to something. They admitted spitting on the cross, though some said they deliberately spat beside it rather than on it. They admitted being told they could have sexual relations with other brothers if they desired, though almost none admitted actually doing so. They described initiation ceremonies that included blasphemous elements. They confirmed the existence of secret ritual. But there's a crucial detail here that must be understood. These confessions were not uniform. Different Templars described different ceremonies. The details varied wildly. Some said they were shown an idol that looked like a head with 3 faces. Others said it was a cat. Still others said they never saw any idol at all. Some said they were forced to deny Christ 3 times. Others said once. The accusations of sexual misconduct were particularly inconsistent, with most Templars say they were given permission to engage in such acts, but denying they ever did so. This inconsistency is exactly what you'd expect from false confessions extracted under torture. If these ceremonies had actually happened, the descriptions would be consistent. Every Templar would describe the same ritual because they'd experienced the same thing. Instead, we see the confused, contradictory testimony of men saying whatever they think will make the pain stop, inventing details that match what their interrogators want to hear. More damning still, when Pope Clement V ordered his own investigation, freed from Philip's direct control and conducted with less torture, almost no Templars confessed to anything. In England, where torture was not extensively used, Templars denied aught charges. In Spain and Portugal, they were generally found innocent. The pattern was clear. Confessions appeared where torture was used and disappeared where it wasn't. But Philip didn't need truth, he needed confessions, and he had them. In November 1307, Pope Clement, under tremendous pressure from Philip, issued the bull Pastorale Praeeminentiae, ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their kingdoms and seize their property. The campaign against the order went international. The trials dragged on for years. In 1310, 54 Templars who had confessed under torture but then recanted those confessions were burned at the stake as relapsed heretics. The message was clear. Confession was the only path to survival, and even then, survival wasn't guaranteed. More Templars died in prison from disease, torture injuries, or deliberate starvation. Some went mad. All suffered. Pope Clement convened the Council of Vienne in 1312 to decide the order's fate. The evidence was thin, the confessions clearly coerced, the accusations unsupported by any physical proof. No idol had been found, despite searches of Templar properties. No witnesses outside the order could confirm any of the allegations. Many bishops argued for the Templars' innocence, or at least for more investigation. But Philip brought an army to Vienne and made clear that he would not accept any verdict except the dissolution of the order. On March 22nd, 1312, Clement issued the Bull Vox in Excelso, officially dissolving the Knights Templar, the order that had existed for nearly 2 centuries, that had defended the Holy Land and pioneered modern banking, that had accumulated vast wealth and enormous prestige, ceased to exist by papal decree. Their properties were officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though in practice Philip and other kings seized most of it for themselves. The Templars' debts, including what Philip owed them, were simply erased. The greatest financial crime in medieval history had been committed under the guise of religious prosecution. Jacques de Molay had been Grand Master of the Knights Templar since 1292, elected to lead the order during its darkest days after the loss of the Holy Land. He was an old man by 1314, in his 70s, broken by years of imprisonment and torture. He had confessed under duress to some of the charges against the order, then recanted, then confessed again as the torture and imprisonment ground away his resistance. Like many Templars, he had said whatever seemed necessary to survive. On March 18, 1314, de Molay and 3 other senior Templars were brought before a tribunal on a platform erected in front of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The sentence was to be read, life imprisonment for their crimes, since they had confessed and shown repentance. It should have been over. De Molay should have accepted the sentence, grateful to escape execution, and faded into obscurity in some dungeon cell. Instead, he stood as straight as his tortured body would allow, and spoke. He proclaimed his innocence, and the innocence of the Order. He declared that the confessions had been extracted through torture and were false. He stated that the Templars had been loyal servants of Christ and of the Church, unjustly persecuted and destroyed by greed and lies. The other condemned Templars joined him in this final act of defiance. Philip IV, informed of this development, flew into a rage. These were relapsed heretics, he declared. They had confessed, then recanted. They had forfeited any chance at mercy. That very evening, without any additional trial or official proceeding, Philip ordered them burned at the stake. A scaffold was erected on a small island in the Seine River. Wood was piled around the posts. As evening fell, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, were led to the stakes. They were tied facing Notre Dame so they could see the cathedral as they died. De Molay reportedly asked to have his hands left free so he could pray, and this request was granted. The flames were lit. According to chroniclers, de Molay remained composed, praying aloud, proclaiming the order's innocence, and calling upon God to witness the injustice being done. And then, as the smoke thickened and the flames rose, he supposedly spoke a curse. The exact words vary in different accounts, but the essence was the same. He summoned both King Philip and Pope Clement to meet him before God's judgment within a year. Legend or truth? We can't know for certain. What we do know is that Pope Clement V died just 1 month later on April 20th, 1314, of what contemporary sources describe as a sudden illness. King Philip IV died in November of that same year in a hunting accident, thrown from his horse and suffering fatal injuries. Both deaths occurred within the year Jacques de Molay predicted. Coincidence? Almost certainly. But in an age that believed deeply in divine judgment and supernatural intervention, the timing seemed like proof that God himself had vindicated the Templars and struck down their persecutors. The story of a curse spread across Europe and became one of the most enduring legends associated with the Order. The Knights Templar were finished. Not every member died. In many kingdoms outside France, Templars were simply pensioned off or absorbed into other religious orders. In Portugal, the order was essentially refounded under a new name as the Order of Christ. In Spain, Templar properties were transferred to new military orders. Some Templars disappeared in anonymity, living out their days as ordinary citizens, but as an organization, as a power, as an institution that had shaped the medieval world, they were gone. Erased, destroyed utterly by a combination of royal greed, papal weakness, and their own inability to adapt when their original purpose disappeared. Let's be brutally clear about what occurred between 1307 and 1314. This wasn't a legitimate prosecution of heretics. This was state-sponsored robbery on a massive scale, disguised as religious justice. King Philip IV of France was bankrupt, owed the Templars a fortune he couldn't repay, and coveted their wealth. He manufactured accusations, tortured confessions out of prisoners, pressured a weak pope into compliance, and destroyed an entire organization to solve his financial problems. The charges against the Templars were false, all of them. We know this for several reasons. First, the lack of physical evidence. If the Templars had been conducting blasphemous ceremonies for 2 centuries, there should have been physical proof. Idols, blasphemous texts, ritual items, something. Philip's men searched Templar properties from top to bottom and found nothing. No mysterious Baphomet, no cords supposedly touched to idols, no evidence of the elaborate heretical practices they were accused of conducting. Second, the inconsistency of the confessions. As mentioned earlier, Templars tortured in different locations described completely different ceremonies. If there had been a standard initiation ritual that included heretical elements, every Templar would describe essentially the same thing. Instead, we get wildly varying accounts that suggest men making up details to satisfy their torturers. Third, the geographical pattern of confessions. Where torture was used extensively, we get confessions. Where it wasn't, we don't. Templars in France confessed. Templars in England, where the king initially resisted using torture, maintained their innocence until Philip pressured England to be more aggressive. Templars in Spain and Portugal were generally cleared of all charges. The correlation between torture and confession is absolute. The fourth, and perhaps most tellingly, Pope Clement himself absolved the Templar leadership of heresy charges in 1308, a year after the arrests. This fact was discovered in the Vatican archives in 2001, when historian Barbara Frey found a document called the Chinon Parchment. It showed that the Pope had conducted his own investigation, found no evidence of heresy, and absolved the Templars. But he was so terrified of Philip that he never made this find in public, and instead allowed the persecution to continue. Clement knew the charges were false, but didn't have the courage to stand up to the French king. So if the charges were false, what about the secrecy of Templar ceremonies? Why conduct initiations behind closed doors if nothing inappropriate was happening? The answer is mundane security. The Templars were a military order operating in hostile territory. They had enemies who would have loved to disrupt their operations or assassinate their leaders. Keeping their ceremonies private was simply good security practice, no different from a modern military unit not broadcasting its operational procedures. There was no sinister reason for the secrecy. What about the kiss during initiation? Medieval culture included numerous ritual kisses. Feudal lords kissed their vassals. Church officials kissed each other. It was a standard gesture of peace and brotherhood, and the Templars' use of it during initiation was completely unremarkable in medieval context. Only in hindsight, viewed through the lens of false accusations, did it seem sinister. The Baphomet? No such idol existed. The name itself is probably a corruption of Muhammad, suggesting that at most some confused testimony mentioned Islam in some context, which was then twisted into accusations of idol worship. Or it might have been entirely invented. We simply don't know, but we know for certain that no physical Baphomet was ever found. The homosexual activity? Given the extreme sexual repression of the rule, combined with the severe penalties for any violation, it seems highly unlikely that such practices were widespread or institutionally encouraged. Were there individual cases? Probably. In any large organization operating over 2 centuries, there will be individuals who violate the rules, but systematic, ritualized homosexuality as part of initiation ceremonies? There's no credible evidence for it. So what really destroyed the Templars? Money, power, politics. They had become too wealthy, too independent, too powerful for kings to tolerate in an age of growing nationalism and centralized authority. They represented medieval internationalism in a world rapidly moving toward nation-states. They answered to the Pope in an era when monarchs were asserting supremacy over the church within their territories. They held enormous financial leverage over rulers who increasingly refused to acknowledge any authority but their own. Philip IV saw an opportunity to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Seizing Templar property would solve his financial crisis. Destroying the order would eliminate a powerful organization that he couldn't control. Manufacturing heresy charges would give him a religious justification for what was ultimately a naked power grab. And pressuring the Pope into complying would demonstrate that even supposedly universal church authority bent to French royal will. It worked. Philip got away with it. He seized enough Templar wealth to stabilize French finances. He demonstrated that he could destroy even the most powerful organizations if they opposed his interests. and he suffered no meaningful consequences beyond dying in a hunting accident that may or may not have been connected to Jacques de Molay's curse. But there were long-term costs to what Philip did. The destruction of the Templars sent a message to every other organization in Christendom that ultimate power rested not with the Pope or with religious authority, but with secular rulers willing to use force. It was another step in the gradual shift from medieval universalism toward modern nationalism. It demonstrated that torture could be used to extract confessions for any purpose, setting a precedent that would be abused for centuries. And it destroyed one of the few organizations that had successfully operated across national boundaries, pursuing goals that transcended narrow royal interests. So what are we to make of the Knights Templar? How do we judge men who lived 800 years ago in a world so different from ours that it might as well be another planet? Do we celebrate their martial prowess and innovative spirit? Do we condemn their violence and their wealth? Do we pity them as victims of political persecution or criticize them for becoming too powerful, too independent, too removed from their original purpose? Perhaps we do all of these things. Perhaps the point isn't to judge, but to understand. To see the Templars as products of their time, while recognizing that their story touches on universal themes that transcend medieval history. The desire to serve something greater than oneself. The corruption that comes with power. The vulnerability of even the mighty when political winds shift. The human capacity for both nobility and weakness. The way good intentions can lead to unintended consequences. The price of idealism in a pragmatic world. These aren't medieval problems. These are human problems, as relevant now as they were in the 12th century. The Knights Templar rose from nothing to become one of the most powerful organizations in the medieval world. They defended the faithful, pioneered finance, fought in legendary battles, accumulated vast wealth, and ultimately were destroyed by that very wealth when a greedy king decided they had become too dangerous to tolerate. Their end was unjust. Their legacy is complicated, and their story remains endlessly fascinating because it speaks to fundamental aspects of human nature and human society. Today, the white mantle with the red cross is worn by historical reenactors, fraternal organizations, and costume enthusiasts. The real Knights Templar are gone, dead for 7 centuries, their bones long since turned to dust. But the idea of the Templars, the symbol they've become, remains very much alive. And perhaps that's as it should be. Men who gave everything for what they believed in and discovered too late that everything could be taken away. Men who succeeded too well at their mission and paid for that success with their lives. Men who were, in the end, just men, trying to do what they thought was right in a chaotic and dangerous world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real history of the Knights Templar, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll be bringing you more of these deep, detailed examinations of history's most fascinating subjects.